I'm back. We're on to chapter 6, titled We'll Fix It in the Lab. But first of all, I just want to remind you about the Mystery Science Theater trading card series. This is number 3 here. But number 4 is all about Manos, the Hands of Fate, and I am very involved in it. I am partnering with Richard Parks, who's putting it together. It's all official with MST, and a lot of my artwork will be involved, and a lot of photographs of my dad's acting career. I'm just going to tease you. See this? This is my dad as King Arthur in Camelot in probably 1969. And there's a lot more where that came from. So, oh, and you probably want to know where to find that. So just Google Mystery Science Theater trading cards and Manos, and a whole page of things will come up. You'll be able to find it. And if you missed the Kickstarter, you can still get the cards. So let's get right into it. We'll fix it in the lab, chapter 6. Hal had finished his movie in less than 6.5 months from the first rehearsal to a contract for national theatrical distribution and a big showy premiere. One way he did it was to keep things moving at a breakneck speed and save on film by doing as few retakes as possible while still getting enough material for a feature-length film. Add to that a liberal sprinkling of the 2 phrases most attributed to him. Don't worry about it, and we'll fix it in the lab. Considering there was neither time nor budget to get the best shot or to do multiple takes, those directions became some of the few options available to the stressed Manos production team. The camera they'd rented to shoot Manos was a 16mm Bell & Howell Filmo 70DR, a true workhorse. The Bell & Howell was a rugged and dependable camera that had a model for every conceivable use. From a G model for filming golf to a 70, a favorite among combat and newsreel photographers in World War II and Korea, and that had captured some of the most dramatic footage of Vietnam. By the late 50s, the Filmo 70DR had become popular with local news programs, which began venturing out into the field. For news stories, Bob Guidry, in his job as a newsman and news cameraman, was probably familiar with this particular model. It had a 3-lens turret that could be rotated for instant lens change, and a separate turret for the viewfinder and focusing, which made focusing a challenge. The camera operated with a spring-driven motor that was wound using a crank attached to the side. A skilled cameraman would hold the camera with his hand stationary and twist the camera to wind it up. Fully wound, it only allowed for a maximum 32-second shot, but had the advantage of not needing an external power source. The electrochrome reversal film used in the camera could be processed locally at smaller labs that could afford the equipment. This saved time for Bob and Hal, who could get the film processed quickly to produce a work print through the same dealer they rented the equipment from. Then they could begin editing before going to Dallas for sound and dubbing. The fingerprints and smudges from Bob Guidry's frenzied news station editing session with Hal anxiously hovering over him still graced that film 44 years later, when Ben Salovey, creator of the HD Blu-ray restoration of Manos, pulled the original work print from a box of 16mm film canisters. It was the same film that had captured the images through the camera lens in 1966. The physical evidence on the film matched Bob's description in a letter to Bernie of the El Paso editing session as a harrowing experience, with Cecil B. DeGod looking over my shoulder the whole time. Bob admitted to Bernie in the letter that after making all the changes and doing the all-night fine cutting marathon, it looks like an entirely different movie. Not any better, but different. After the El Paso editing session, a black and white 16mm print was produced for the voice dubbing session. The mysterious lab where all the dubbing, sound production, and final fine cutting would take place was probably Producer Sound Services in Dallas, according to Bob in a letter to Bernie. In the mid-60s, the lab specialized in sound production and dubbing primarily for the Charlie Brown and Tarzan cartoons, and sound recordings for TV programs like The Doris Day Show, according to IMDb. Bill Jennings rented a big station wagon to make the trip from El Paso to Dallas, with Bill, Hal, Tom, and John to dub their lines. Bob Guidry had declined to make the trip. Along for the ride were Bill's wife Polly and son Benton, who would be visiting Polly's parents in Fort Worth. The six of them traveled straight across 640 miles of often barren Texas in less than 9 hours, plus the brief side trip to Fort Worth to deliver Polly and Benton. Bill's family was lucky. They'd be flying home after their visit, while the Manos gang would stay a few extra days to work before driving home nearly nonstop. The Manos dubbing session also gives rise to one of the film's most distinctive traits, the fact that all its female characters are voiced by a single woman. And this came about because Hal told Diane Marie, the only woman whose role was deemed important enough to be dubbed by the actress herself, that she would have to get to Dallas for the session on her own dime. Because she'd received no payment for her acting role, Diane had no intention of spending more money on the dubbing session. So, in typical Hal style, he found a female voiceover artist to dub all the female characters' voices, including mine. That woman happened to be his wife, Norma's younger sister, Marcia Friedman, who lived in Dallas. Marcia had trained as an opera singer in her youth and had aspired to a career as a professional singer. However, her health issues and those of her mother had curtailed her dreams. In 1966, she was living with and caring for her mother in Dallas when Hal asked if she'd be willing to lend her beautiful voice to his film, for family's sake and pro bono, of course. She agreed and soon found herself in the studio of Producer Sound Services, meeting the actors for the first time, with little chance to review the script. In all, Marcia did the voices for Maggie, 6 wives, 2 women travelers, and 6-year-old Debbie. When you really listen to the dialogue, it's quite amazing how she managed to make the voices of all these characters sound a bit different from one another. Although not all of the women had lines, the scene with the squabbling wives included a fair amount of random comments and mumbling. The head wife, the other wives, and Maggie all sound different. I doubt anyone other than a linguist would have been able to tell they were all voiced by the same person. But it's in the voice of Debbie where the facade falls apart. Marcia, like many of the other players, can't be blamed for being unprepared for her role. She probably hadn't seen the script until the El Paso group arrived in Dallas. She would have had little time to review, and having to voice a child so young could well have been a surprise. She did the best job possible under the circumstances and deserves far more credit than she's gotten for the job she did. It's ironic that a woman who wanted a vocal career would achieve recognition posthumously in a way she would never have imagined. After the dubbing sessions were complete and everyone else had gone home, Hal stayed behind in Dallas to finish the fine cutting and sound production. Somehow, in the editing process, too much of the scene where the credits were initially meant to be cut, or it's possible that the full intended length of the scene was never shot to begin with. The script states that when the family first arrives at the Valley Lodge and the camera pans the area of desolation in a long shot, before coming in on the door and Torgo stepping out, there should be sufficient time and footage to add the credits. In any case, the credits got tucked into the end of the film rather than during the long opening driving scene, which makes the out-of-context scene seem even more purposeless. Where to place the credits was the least of the issues involving that topic. Most movies have lots of jobs listed and lots of names to go with them. Hal's movie only had a few people involved, but some of these were omitted from the credits, while others were rearranged or fabricated to create the illusion of a fuller crew. Jay Hall, who is listed as a master's wife, was actually an El Paso businessman whose uncredited secretary played one of the women travelers at the end of the film. The other traveler, credited as Pat Coburn, was actually one of the wives, Leilani Hansard, credited as a wife, and who was Judge Coldwell's secretary in real life, played the other woman traveler. Presumably, Hal didn't take any cast notes with him when he went to Dallas and just winged it as he often did in his effort to get things done. Thomas Ivy is credited with costume and set design, while Jacqueline gets credit for makeup. Thomas is my dad's first name and Ivy is his middle name. Jacqueline is a longer made-up version of Jackie, my mom's name. It's clear that Hal was trying to pad the credits, but odd that some of the real people didn't get credit at all. Someone named George Cavender gets credit as the deputy, but no trace of him has been found, while there is a handwritten name Georgia in the script attributed to a wife, but no Georgia in the credits. Again, maybe just because Hal didn't know who they were or couldn't recall in the rush of the moment. Although the names of score composer Robert Smith and lyricist Russ Huddleston was included, none of the other musicians who played on the soundtrack were credited. Set photographer Ansel Spring didn't get a mention either. Everyone involved in Manos who has been rediscovered so far has said that they're not disappointed to be overlooked after seeing how bad the movie turned out, but they are very good-natured about their involvement and all have said they don't regret the experience. Under the pressure of getting the post-production job done so quickly, miscommunication contributed to preventable mistakes, mainly the lack of sync between sound and action. Perhaps it was simply a matter of budget and time constraint, or edits may have been made after the soundtrack was put in, but awkward sync was one of the issues that could have been reduced in the lab. But all the lab magic in the world couldn't change the out-of-focus shots, misplaced props, or the melodramatic swish of the master's robe filmed on that hot summer bug-infested nights in the lower valley. Regardless of all the big and small details that were glossed over, finessed, or ignored, the show would go on. The completed 16mm film with sound and soundtrack journeyed to its final destination, Deluxe Entertainment Services, a film processing laboratory where a 35mm blow-up inner negative was made and theatrical prints produced from the inner negative for distribution. The audience at the premiere would have been watching a copy of a copy. As bad as the film was to begin with, the hasty editing and cheap lab work had cropped the intended images and muddied the color, rendering it even more unwatchable. It is known what Hal thought when he saw the first screening of the finished product. Oh, it is unknown. Sorry. His thoughts at that time were pure speculation. Was he proud because, after all, he had finally made a movie? Was he embarrassed while faking it with a "I meant to do that" attitude? Did he subscribe to the notion that any press is good press? All this and more? Hal was a complicated man with an optimistic opinion of his own abilities. Regardless of the outcome, he would keep striding toward his dreams with his head held high. A finished movie in the can and a distributor were a good start. Thank you so much. Next one tomorrow is Chapter 7, The Tragedy of Torgo. Thank you for being with me, and I'll see you tomorrow.